Greetings, friends. Your cartoonist pal Stan here with a brand new episode of 50 Years in the Dungeon, the show that I'm doing to celebrate the hobby and game and profession of tabletop role playing game, and more broadly, the related board games and fiction, other things like that. I started it out about the 50th anniversary of D&D, and we're plunging forward. We're going to keep going here in the new year and keep celebrating. And so, as those of you who've been watching know, I've begun to broaden out and talk to people who are not necessarily associated with D&D, though a lot of them have worked in-house and worked on the game. A lot of them done a lot of other interesting things. And the person I'm talking to today fits all of those categories. She is a Hugo and Nebula award-winning author, and I worked with her at Wizards of the Coast on the D&D team, and she is currently working with our good friends at Kobold Press, uh, doing crowdfunding for her new game, her new cozy RPG called RiverBank, which looks really awesome, and I'm very excited about, and I can't wait to talk to her about all that and more. So why would I delay anymore when I can bring right on my good friend, Kij Johnson? Kij, thank you for joining
Hey
me today.
there.
Hello.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm super excited about it.
Well, that makes two of us. Um, you're in the Midwest. You're in Kansas, right? Uh,
I am in Kansas, yeah.
you are in
In
Kansas.
Lawrence, Kansas. I am always in Kansas, although not every minute am I in Kansas. But yeah, Lawrence, Kansas, which is the northeastern corner, a hotbed of liberalism surrounded by red. And also, I've been here for 13 years, and it's like uh, I'm pretty much enjoying it, although I expect I'll be moving up farther north to be closer to family at some point.
So the one thing I didn't say in my brief intro for you is that you spent a good amount of time as a professor teaching
Mhm.
writing, and is it mostly focused on writing or on literature also?
Yeah. Well, it was mostly focused on writing, but part of why they hired me is that at the time, the Gun Center for the Study of Science Fiction
Hmm.
was under the aegis of Jim Gunn still. And Jim, who was at that point probably 80s plus, late 80s, was slowing down about a lot of stuff and really wanted some people on staff who could keep things moving. So I did a lot of stuff about fantasy and science fiction. I occasionally taught science fiction and fantasy. I presented summer workshops and um, did a conference every summer for science fiction, and taught a lot of creative writing. So I've read many a terrible story, and you can't always forget them.
You know, uh, I did not do uh, that level of academia, but I did some time teaching, and yeah, you can't shake it, right? What you read it and it sticks with.
Certain stories you'll never forget. They live for free in your brain.
um, so yeah, uh, usually the conversations I like to start off talking about how it is that gaming and fantasy and this kind of genre came into your life.
I grew up in a really small town in Iowa in the 1960s and 70s. I didn't have a lot of friends, and I had a brother. And my brother, who is just a hair younger than me, I don't know how he got involved in war games, but he did, the old classic Avalon Hill style
Right?
games. And he every penny he had, he spent on those games, and he saved his Christmas money. And every year we would go into the Twin Cities. This is so I was probably somewhere between 10 and 12, 13. Um, before that, I mean, he was a very smart kid, but we would go to Little Wars in
Yeah.
Minneapolis, and we would go in. He would buy whatever the latest Avalon Hill was, and I would paw over the paints and the minis. And uh, so my first experience playing was actually military minis,
Hmm.
and Kingmaker with my brother.
Right.
Um, and those were the two things I did. When I got to college, I found people who played Dungeons and Dragons. I was the only girl, of course. And at least at that point, my eventually my senior or one of my roommates started playing. And then there were two of us at least some of the time. But that was when I went to my first Gen Con, my first con, which was called it was the Tin Soldier or Toy Soldier, whatever. The Little Tin Soldier was the Minneapolis thing, but they had a conference or a convention, um, which was minifigs and Empire of the Petal
Pedal
Throne, if you
Thrones.
recall that.
Yeah.
Yes. They had every year they had it played again because the designer was local, I
Yeah.
believe. And we would play, and Dungeons and Dragons started, chainmail, but Dungeons and Dragons started in there. I went to my first Gen Con then when I was 21, back when I was at the community college.
Okay.
And I ill-advisedly wore a furry bikini, because
Well, it was
my
accepted.
character was a furry bikini character. She was a barbarian. Or, and I had read a certain amount of Red Sonja, and
Mm.
so of course I was, and so naively, my female friend, who's Helen, who was a paladin or something, and I, who was a barbarian, dressed up in our little outfits.
Yeah.
We had a great
Well,
time, but my hand has never been kissed so many times.
I bet.
Uh,
Thankfully, if it's just your hand.
yeah, well, it was, 1980, so Um, but and that
So
was the start of
can,
it.
can I?
Later on, I got involved in cyberpunk. I played a lot of cyberpunk, and so so some years later, I ran out of group for a little while there, and then some years later, I found this fantastic group, and we played cyberpunk and the beginnings of Shadowrun, and
Huh,
didn't really play a lot of D&D.
it's you know what?
But
Honestly, neither did I. But
uh-huh.
so back with the when you were uh, before you went to college and you were doing
Oh,
board games with your
amazing.
brother and such, and you were saying that the minis. Did you get into painting minis to doing?
Well, the painting was yeah, oh, no, I did
Uh,
not.
uh,
I'm a
I'm just
little
asking. I'm just curious.
no, I'm a little obsessive, and of course, every time you would go into a game shop, and there weren't very many back then,
Right.
but there was always somebody painting with, one of those brushes that has like one badger hair, and they're like adding eyelashes to a character. And they were so impressive. And they looked like they'd be really fun to do, but all that paint was super expensive.
Yeah.
And the first time I tried, all my paint dried out, of course, because you had to be very delicate with that tester stuff. Um, and so and when I started thinking about, painting 30 identical or nearly identical Korean warrior princesses,
Right.
I just, my heart quailed. So I gave it the minimum I could get away with, and which, and everybody had very decided opinions about what the minimum was.
Right.
It's like, uh, you couldn't just use the metal; you had to at least give it a base coat. But there were groups where it was like, no, 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 that's wholly inadequate. You have to at least, differentiate the faces or differentiate the weapons or something like that. So it was an undertaking. I don't really have very good eyesight, and I never did. So painting was fatiguing for my eyes
Right.
anyway. But yes, but I did have a certain number of those figs that knocked around with me for a while. And and an awful lot of like from the early days of playing. Oh, I still have my player character sheets
Yeah. Yeah.
with the drawings because of course I was like very into the drawings. And oh, I look at them now. I actually showed some to a friend. I was so proud of an assassin character I had. She was. This was during the dungeon years when they would come up with all these wild character classes like Houri,
Right.
Houri, and so you could play a Houri. Except my group would never let me, so I played an assassin that was as close to a Houri as I could get away with. And I was so proud of her little outfit, and it was those were good times, Stan.
So, how early did you become a fan of fantasy fiction? I mean, because part of the story is
Early, yeah.
to,
Um,
to your
I start,
writing. So,
yeah. I mean, I started reading. I didn't start writing till 5 years after I had been playing role-playing games,
mm,
actually. But I started reading fantasy from the time I was really, really little. My mom was a children's librarian,
mm,
and she taught or she was a librarian in a school where fifth and sixth graders, and she would bring the books home.
right.
And she brought everything home, and my brother and I read it all because we were both fast and voracious readers. Um, and I have a theory based on my personal experience, which is that there is a point in your childhood when maybe you're 7 or 8 or 9 when you're given a choice between The Hobbit and a Beverly Cleary story. It
Okay.
doesn't mean you won't read both of them, but there's one that your little infant paw reaches out for, and mine reached out for The Hobbit. So I think that uh, people people are just drawn
Yeah.
towards one or the other, realist fiction or fantasy or unreal fictions, we might call them. Irreal fictions is what we would say in academia.
Iriel. Okay.
And Irrealism, yes. And so to me, I just really, I never didn't read that. I read a lot of mysteries as well,
Mm.
but I never didn't read science fiction and fantasy. And
Are you
I
are
grew up in,
you familiar
a,
the with the Japanese manga Lone Wolf and Cub?
oh yeah, yeah.
So your story about the Beverly Cleary and the Hobbit. I don't know if you remember this.
Oh, the
The
sword and
ball and
what
the
was it?
sword that
Yes,
when he's
yes.
when our for those who don't know, our lead character is a samurai assassin. He has a baby. His wife has been killed. He's decide whether
Mandalorian.
good stories are worth using again.
They
And
really
he's
are.
deciding whether what to do with the child, whether because this is going to be a terrible life. So he decides to let the child choose, and he puts him on the tatami mat and puts a sword and a ball. And if he goes for the ball, well then the assassin's life is not for him. But if he goes for the sword, then he's definitely in it. And this is
Yes.
the start of the whole story. The baby grabs the sword or grabs
And
for him.
I grabbed The Hobbit.
You grab the hobbit.
Yeah, so I read a lot of fantasy and mysteries, as I said. And when I was 24, and I wrote poetry. I wrote terrible poetry, as indeed did most of
Didn't we
us
all?
when we were 14 and 15. But I took a class on writing science fiction, continuing ed class, and I really enjoyed it. So if it had been a mystery class, I probably would be a mystery writer because I liked them both equally. But as it happened, I ended up writing science fiction and fantasy. And everything in my life really became this sort of things cross pollinating.
Mm,
So, writing science fiction meant that I worked for a small magazine, which got me my first job in publishing, which was at a book publisher, a science fiction publisher, which got me my first job in comics, got me outside of book publishing, which then got me my job at Wizards, which then got me to TSR.
wow, 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 wow. All right, no, there's a bunch
Yeah.
of I wanna explore some of those steps But before we do, I'm going to make sure that I get my app all set here. I'm going to open up uh, switch views, come to my iPad. People ask, so I will tell you that I use an iPad using an iPad Pro and the Apple Pencil and the app Procreate is how I do these things. Not sponsored, just to be clear on that, but people ask, so I say.
People
I
like to know what technology are you
Yeah,
using. They just do. Yeah.
I mean, I ask the same questions of my when I talk, what pen are you using? What do you so yeah, people ask, so you tell them.
I have I have strong feelings about pens.
As you should.
Right?
Um, all right, so I'm going to be drawing an homage to the cover of your new product, RiverBank.
Eee. Cool.
Um, I tell you, while I was looking at this, at first I thought that this guy in the middle in the rowboat was a frog, but then I noticed he's got a tail, so I see he's a newt of some
He is
sort.
not. He is in fact in mute.
Good thing I noticed that before I started drawing.
Well, then it would just be an homage. And
All right, so you started playing D&D in college, and
Mhm.
you just made a bunch of leaps there, right? You went
Yeah.
from playing that to it got you your first job, and then da, da, da. Just kind of quickly, what did you major? What were you majoring in college?
Oh, I majored in as close as you could to setting design for D&D. I went to a school called St. Olaf College, and they had something called the Para College, where you could if if you could find a professor who was willing to do a tutorial for you, you could do anything. And so for 4 years, basically, I had one wonderful advisor who knew about 7 languages. He was an ancient. He knew like Anglo-Saxon and Hungarian. He knew a ton of languages,
Wow.
and um, I ended up taking a lot of history, early history, so sub-Roman Britain, Anglo-Saxon Britain, up to 1066. But I really lose interest at about 800. I took history classes and theology classes and language classes and linguistics classes. And by classes, I mean I talked my tutor into letting me do a tutorial with him on each of these. So I ended up in my senior year with a couple of years of college Latin, which I actually did take classes, 3 years of Anglo Saxon, 3 years of ancient English history. And my, excuse me, my thesis was a cultural history. I made up an island south of England, and then basically built a setting for a game.
Wow.
Excuse me. Hang on, I'm just about to cough.
Go ahead. Go ahead. This, you know
That's
what? I
always
would want to
fun.
make up that too. I would love to have
It was
done that.
awesome. In fact, the only real criticisms that we got or that I got were the fact that I didn't care about the characters. I did not care about the actual history. What I cared about is building settings, situations uh, into which people could install their characters.
Right.
So essentially, I generated a Romano-British sub-Roman or Roman British setting for Dungeons and Dragons. And I do think that I wrote to TSR when I was like 21 to say, oh, there was a job. I remember Sue Wineline and I were talking about this earlier. You know, there was a job available at TSR and I was just the right age, and so I applied for it, and of course, nothing came of it. But I do remember thinking that they could just take my entire setting and just use it however they liked, which they didn't.
But they could have.
But they might have, right. So yeah, my undergraduate
So
degree
I will
was.
just take a second. Say Sue is in the chat now. Hello, Sue,
Hi,
and
Sue.
hello, Michael J. Pastor, and to
Hi, and I
understand.
see you had a question. You were asking, yes, in fact, I was one of the only girls in wargaming. I knew one other girl who played, in fact, I was the only girl I knew who did wargaming at all. Um, and then when role playing, I was the only girl who role played in any of the groups I was in college until one other person got involved. And then it was me and Helen for a short period. But yeah, it was weird times. I had Thaco explain to me a whole lot again and again and again.
Can we explain it to you? Sure.
Yeah, yeah. Don't make me do it though, please. But yeah, so that was sort of the start of everything. I got this useless degree. I joked when I first started to work at Wizards of the Coast that for the first time in my life, my undergraduate degree finally turned out to be useful because all of that stuff about setting design and all of the stuff I'd learned about world building from basically interpolating from what documentation and archaeological evidence there was, I was spending a lot of time figuring out, filling in the gaps. So, we knew how Roman toilets work, Roman bathrooms worked, and we have them in other parts of Roman Britain. And so I'd be like, okay, so how would it be different on my island? How would it be the same? So there was like so much of that kind of work, and it was just so delightfully obsessive. I still have it, and I looked at it and I illustrated it. It was full of
uh,
drawings. I'm so proud of it even
I want to
now.
see that. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Sorry, I
it's
never
in the
heard about that
basement.
before.
It's in the basement somewhere.
All
Yes, so
right.
that
So
was the
you
start of it.
you came out and you got a job in publishing. You said what was that?
Well, there were paths before that. When I went into academia, I told people that was my fourth or maybe my fifth career. So through my 20s, I worked in bookstores.
Mm,
And back in the days when chain bookstores were a thing, and always immediately glommed the science fiction and fantasy sections. And then I would, in a never ending battle with home office, I'd be expanding it steadily and adding more authors. And this is actually the 80s. So this is the golden age of women's fantasy.
mm,
This is when we have Phyllis Ann Carr and the very first CJ Cherry, and we've got, Jennifer Robeson and Joy Chant. We've got just these amazing writers. So I would expand and expand and expand. Misty Lackey starts here. And then they would say, no, 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 it can only be 3 days. And then I would start creeping and creeping, and they'd say, no, it has to be face out. And I'd keep creeping. So that was my 20s. And then this and that happened. I started writing. I moved to Oregon
mm.
to join a writing group, and then ended up moving to New York to move in with my then boyfriend. And because I had attended the Clarion West workshop, which is a 6-week intensive workshop for writers of science fiction and fantasy, I knew somebody in publishing and got my very first job in publishing, which was an assistant managing editor at Tor Books. And 2 weeks later, the entire managing editor staff quit, and I was now the managing editor at Tor Books. At that point, we
Wow.
were doing about 650 books a year. So I didn't actually know that was an obscenely large amount. And so I just kind of, zoned out and managed to do that. But that was the start of the publishing stuff. Then Dark Horse was because I kind of liked living in Oregon. So Dark Horse was in Milwaukee, and I basically wrote them and said, "You need to hire me." So, and I'm again really glad I did because by now I really had all of the nerd jobs. I mean, I worked in tech, I worked in games, I have not worked in computer games, and I have not worked in film, like movies, but I
Right.
have had so many of the other nerd jobs. And they were sometimes annoying and always underpaid, but they were also really interesting.
So what? Wow, I could have hour-long conversations about you with you about each of these, but I won't. um, when you were so
Episode 17 of my conversation with Kij
right,
Johnson.
right, Kiz, you are 18 times more fascinating than I knew, and I already thought you were fascinating. Um,
I am both complimented and surprised.
uh, so at Tor, which I've never talked to you about, what uh,
No,
what were some of the what were some of the lines or books that you worked on that are most memorable? I mean, we
all
don't
of
have to go
them.
about this for in depth, but kind of I want to touch on that a little.
No, I was the managing editor, which for Tor is a production position. I'm the person who, once the editors had generated a novel that they thought was ready to go, and the marketing people had signed off, then the manuscript was handed to two people, me and Maria, the art director. And between the two of us, we got them copy edited and typeset and printed and covers made and all of the materials, blurbs written, and all
Right.
of that was done sort of on our watch. And this what's probably best known of the stuff I was working on is that I started there on the third book of the Wheel of Time series.
Mm.
And at that, and the reason why I ended up the managing editor is that the last Wheel of Time novel, Volume 2, had basically driven the entire managing editorial staff out of the
Oh,
job.
that's what did
So
it.
yep, it actually was. So I made it through three of the books, and that was a record at that moment. Yeah, so I did that. We did a lot of Orson Scott Card. Um, uh, we had this start of, it wasn't Terry Goodkind, but it was another one of the big fat fantasy writers.
Mm.
And we were doing like a lot of Conan books. There were many,
Uh,
many Conan books being written by various people. And they were always very fun to work on for a lot of reasons.
um, this would have been the mid to late '80s.
No, this would have been 92, 92. And then from 92 to 94, which is when I went to Dark Horse Comics, they didn't have a consistent collections and graphics novels line, which is what they hired me to do. And
Right.
so I got to work with everybody again, because that means every single person who touched, every single creator that we worked with, they did a collection, and I'm the person who made that collection happen, unless there were reasons not to, because there were a few people who would do things, and um, they really only wanted to work with the guy who ran the company, and that was fine too.
Randy.
Yeah, Randy.
Yeah.
Actually, Mike Richardson,
Mike.
when I was there. And that was again, another industry where I was like one of about three women doing that kind of work. And it was an interesting place to work. But within 2 years, I quit to try writing full time, and then decided I hated it because it is a lot of stress. Oh my goodness, I see a Dale Donovan in the
Dale
comments.
Donovan. Hello,
So
Dale.
happy. Yes, yes. Hi, Dale. I was just thinking of you the other day.
See, I told you sometimes
Long
old
and
friends show up here.
they do. It's so nice to see. Um, but yeah, so then Dark Horse, and then in 95 I came to Wizards of the Coast, and
Mm.
my first experience was doing Magic the Gathering stuff, um, working on continuity, managing continuity. And then TSR came on board, and that changed everything. We had a bunch of really, really great designers who came over with it. And we and TS Wizards didn't really know what to do with a bunch of them. So I ended up heading a design group that was included Wolf Bauer, Taylor Woodruff, and Mike Selinker. And we four were the gang of four, and they would sort of point us at different things that were not Wizards of the like Magic the Gathering. So we
So that was
designed web games.
before the Wizards buyout, right? So that
It
was
was right before it.
the original
Yes,
RPG group.
right. That was right before it. You're right. Because, and they still didn't quite know what to do with us. And then TSR came on, and then I switched over to TSR. And I had been a big trading card player. That's how I got the job at Wizards, was that I played Magic the Gathering and had a set of Moxes, which I later sold. And to this day, I would, someday, if I kept them, oh, no, one must not think about what you would have done if you had kept your Black Lotus in this world.
Right.
Um, so yeah, by that time I had worked in comics and graphic novels. I'd worked with some of the first stuff being brought over in manga. Studio Proteus was translating manga, and we were printing them. I'd
Right.
worked in science fiction
Right. So yeah,
publishing.
of course you would have known Lone Wolf.
Yes, yes, of
Right,
course
of
I
course.
would. In
So
fact, I would have read it
if I
all.
thought about it, I wouldn't have phrased it with that way. Of course you know that.
Yeah, no, I read everything at that point. When I finally broke up the set, I had about 1,200 graphic novels. And anybody who's ever moved graphic novels knows that they are clearly made out of the heart of Jupiter.
Yeah.
They just carve out rectangles, and that's your book. And so I had, oh, these are so cute. I am loving this. They are so cute. Your drawing is charming me. But yeah, uh, so I did. In fact, Fox Trick, I'm sorry. I do see, yes, I did work with Tor, as I recall, and did, various things, Appleseed and, Dominion and, a bunch of things that were really important at that stage, but then, you don't hear too much about them anymore.
Yeah, well, I've still got them over on the shelves over there.
Right? Yeah. No, I eventually winnowed out the collection. I probably have 200 now. So that's a win, right?
Yeah.
But some of the problem is that if you like series that have gone on for a while, all of a sudden you've got like 40 of them, and you can't quite get rid of any one of them.
Right.
So
Yeah. No, you've got to keep
so
them all or get
200
rid of
is
them
only
all.
5 authors.
I one of the like so many people, one of the ones that I got into in that early first wave was Nausicaa, and
Yeah, yeah.
I've got at least at least four different collections for
Yep.
different, like the very first one they put out. There's one volume I never could get, and it's my favorite, just as a the style of the printing. They were such classy little books, and
Mhm.
I there was one that I never got, and so I won't get
Oh,
rid of
the
the others because I want to get that last one. But
because someday.
yeah,
Well, I mean, this isn't exactly germane, and we can come back to it, but I have all of the Titan Modesty Blaze collections,
right,
which is fine. There's like 40 of them, as I said, and they ranged in price from about $15 to way more than 300. Because by the time I got to Sweet Caroline, the one I couldn't find anywhere, there came a day when I was like, I could just sell a kidney because
right,
I can't not finish this set. So I eventually finished the set, and now I'm terrified because if I can't loan them to anyone, because if I break up the set, then I have to buy another
right.
$300 book just to fill out the set. It's so bitter.
Um, it's tough being a collector.
It is. It really is.
Um, all right, so before the
We
TSR buyout, what were some of the things that you and the original gang were working on? I mean, I know, but I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of people watching who don't know about this first era
yeah.
of RPGs at Wizards.
There was it's uh it was an interesting, the cat keeps trying to drink what I'm drinking. So let me just put something on top of that cup. No, you cannot have it. You want to, but you cannot. You shall not pass. We uh when I got to Wizards, they were expanding just exponentially. When I originally wanted to work for a company of about 25 people, and when I interviewed with them, they were at about 25 people, and when I started there, I was employee 124 or something like that.
It
And
happened.
then it just kept booming. They had periodic retrenchments, but there was a point at which they really could not throw their money away fast enough, and they would just try stuff. And they would research things, like actually invest time in researching things. So the four of us, the gang of four, they set us a sort of mandate to try to figure out what it would take to make a viable uh, live, massive, what we think of now as a massive multi-user
Yeah,
experience,
yeah,
a game. And so they had two things they wanted to know. It's like, what would make this the best game out there? Um, and the second thing was, is that my phone or is that yours?
not mine.
Oh, so peculiar. I don't know why my phone is on. I have no plans on Wednesday nights. But and the other thing was to figure out why girls were not as interested in playing these games as boys were, men and women
Right,
actually.
right.
And we did enormous amounts of research, and we looked at people who were writing like live action games for that were quote targeted to women or girls, because at that point there was this sense that boys and girls played games differently. And I keep saying boys and girls, I mean men and women. Um, and we made a bunch of proposals, and said, really the things that would help will we gave them a list basically, and those things have all been implemented, but at that time they were difficult, and they were things like slider bar body shapes, and multiple choices for avatar appearance, things like that, and all of that was pretty hard back then, and so nobody was doing it. So it was really fun to work on, but they decided not to. And then what happened is they licensed Baldur's Gate. So we were not working on Baldur's Gate, but we did all of this sort of proto work where we were thinking about stuff that would end up making the first Baldur's Gate.
Right.
Um, so, so we did that, and did some other things too. And then because they were doing more and more promotional web games for the Wizards products, we ended up doing promotional games of different sorts for Magic the Gathering, for BattleTech, which was my real
Mm.
favorite. I loved BattleTech, and or Mech Warrior, and we did that for a while, and then the TSR thing happened, and I know that like Wolf and Mike had both worked for TSR before that. I don't remember if Taewon had, so they were all like, "Oh, this is going to be great." And it really was. I mean, it was. I know it was hard on the TSR people, and but
Mm.
I do think that it was also pretty. It was exciting for Wizards because it forced them out of their some of their assumptions.
It was an interesting. I mean, from my perspective, it was an interesting time. It also forced some of the TSR people out. So there were a lot of people in Lake Geneva who got
Yeah.
very comfortable with sitting in Lake Geneva, knowing they were the kings of the world, and
Yes.
uh,
Yeah.
um, there were a bunch. So I'm. It's come up on this show a lot. 1995 was the last really big hiring wave at TSR. It's a group that
Yeah.
we've in I guess in my little world we've come to call to refer to the class of '95, and
Oh,
there was a bunch of, and a lot of us came from other game companies, and it was kind of a beginning of the shakeup that would continue when Wizards physically relocated and just
yeah.
changed the shaking, the thinking, the shape of the
So,
thinking.
that's interesting too, because 95 is when I was hired, when Wizards was in its explosive growth phase. You also had, which was the British group? Was it the Warhammer guys, Game Designers Workshop? And they were going through explosive
Yeah.
growth. And you had, World of Darkness. You had the White Wolf guys, and all of these things were exploding. Um, and yet, it's like I don't really recall that role-playing games were, or in fact games were starting to take over the world, despite the fact that occasionally somebody would write an article that said we were. But I don't remember that. So it is interesting that so many places were expanding at the same time.
Well, it certainly was a time when I think White Wolf had a big to do with it. It was the
Yeah.
in a long time was the first bubble out of the fan base to a new group
Hmm.
that hadn't been in it before, um,
Hmm.
and that always comes with um, pluses and minuses, threats,
Well, actually, I mean,
advantages.
we'd also seen it with collectible card games,
Yes,
you
well,
know.
that and that
Uh,
too.
LARPs and TCGs, they were both places where the audience changed. And I think you could argue Game Designers Workshop was the same way, because
Yeah,
the people who came to it, some of them are role players, some of them are minifigs or war gamers, but there were also these new populations that were coming in who hadn't been part of it before, or maybe had only been adjacent. An awful lot of the World of Darkness folks, the players and stuff, they were people who had played D&D, but just, it hadn't scratched the itch the way that, Vampire the Masquerade or any of the other ones did.
and I mean, we certainly talked about it at Lake Geneva uh, and beyond. Um, the uh, the thing about Vampire the Masquerade was it did resonate with. It had a much higher percentage of women than D&D did,
Mhm.
and
Right.
um,
And it was a place where women felt, and I'm speaking generically about something that I really only know anecdotally, but the World of Darkness was a place where a woman could go play, and people were not going to ask you if your boyfriend got you into it or try to
right,
explain THAC0 to you. There was an assumption that you could be part of the community. And while there were dismissive, what are they called? Storytellers, the lead, the GMs. There would be people who might be dismissive, but you saw a lot less of that than you did if you were playing, for instance, Traveler
yeah,
or Cyberpunk with the wrong crowd.
right.
There were plenty of opportunities to be dismissive if people wanted to be, and there were various reasons why they might be. But yeah, World of Darkness, it's like, it gave you a chance to do a whole bunch of things that were fun, and it also was a place for women to go, where they were not going to be the only person in the room. I say that, and yet my favorite gaming group was all women. So, and that was
I was
my
going to say
cyberpunk
it's.
group.
I think that I don't know. One of the things I'm getting from all these conversations is that there, there's a there's a very distinct line that we didn't pay enough attention to between the people who are the ones that would come out to conventions
Hmm.
and and the people who were playing at home, just playing at
Hmm.
home, never even thought about anything other than playing in their home groups. And
Hmm.
there's a whole lot of those which are much more gender balanced. Right?
Hmm.
It was the wow. I was about to say something which is going to be very dismissive of of convention culture that I was a part of. But convention culture in that era was very masculine,
Mhm.
very nerd masculine. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah, it was a certain kind of nerd
Yeah,
masculine. There were plenty of people who are happy to see you, happy, and I mean, and there's comparable experiences for players of color, but
yeah, yeah,
what I
yeah,
can
yeah.
speak to is what it was like to be a woman.
Absolutely.
And there was a lot of just, there was a lot of people who played with their friends. I knew when I was in this all woman group, I also knew a group which was three married couples,
Hmm.
so 50-50 balance. And it had gotten started because of one of the couples where they both had been serious players, and then they would bring in the other couples as couples. And it was really so for them. In fact, you could not join that group because it was like trying to join somebody else's bridge foursome. They're like,
Right.
no, we already have everybody. And if you're not a married couple that we like both of you or not, it's just kind of like a swinger party, I guess, you know, except, role playing games,
Except
which,
role play.
okay, granted. But, yeah, it was, I think there was a lot of balance, more balance going on. And I think also if you start thinking about all the people, and I was one of them in my 20s who bought all the books but didn't have anyone to play with,
Right.
because whatever I brought, if and I was buying everything, and so I was going to have to find a group that was interested in playing RuneQuest or Bunnies and Burrows, who are not going to give me a hard time, and were going to be willing to play that instead of their preferred game, which was D&D. And that was that's three things in a row that you have to get them to jump,
Right.
jump through those hoops. And that was just too much. And so I would buy the games and I would read the games and I would fantasize about playing the games and I would imagine what it would be like to be in a group. But I was also a timid game master. And so I wasn't willing to take the chance, and also kind of socially anxious. I wasn't really willing to take the chance of putting together a group of strangers to play Bunnies and Burrows or,
Right.
Traveler. I brought that up earlier, you know, because I wasn't confident that I was going to be able to do it with sufficient authority.
Hmm.
And authority was super important back then. There was a real sense the GM knows everything. The GM is God. The GM knows nobody else. It's like whatever the GM says, that's the truth. But
Right.
except that we all knew that's not 100% true. The GM, because if a GM skipped a rule or skipped a mechanic, everybody at the table would be like, wait, you forgot to do the blank.
Right.
Wait, we didn't roll initiative. Um, so it was, so it's just super interesting to kind of ask that question. It's like there are all these different ways we use these games. And for me, it was just like fairy tales. I could read all about this fascinating world, and pretend, and which actually is pretty useful tool for a writer, to spend
Yeah.
a lot of your time saying, okay, given this world, what would be a cool story to tell inside of it.
Um. All right. So we're closing in. We're getting close to an hour already. I told you that was going to happen very fast.
But
I'm
it
kind of
does, you did say
trying
that.
to both follow up on the things that are really interesting there and still kind of move forward because I'd want to talk more about your writing too. And
Hmm.
certainly people have been asking questions about that in the chat. But
Hmm.
I think I think that one of the things that uh, has really fueled our current explosion of the popularity of role playing is the fact that thanks to the internet and the popularity of the streaming shows, there there's not the mystery there used to. People used to tell people that you play a role playing game, and they would go,
Right.
"What?" When I was in Japan, I ran an
Hmm.
English language role playing group that was across Japan. We basically
Hmm.
hooked gamers together. And I took out ads in the free English language newspapers to say, we are the role playing, blah, 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 blah. and I would get phone calls from people who who would there were people that knew what it was and they wanted to do, and there were people who were like, "What? What
What's
do
it? What
you
do you
mean
mean? Yeah.
role playing?" And some
Hmm.
of them were role playing gaming curious, and some of them were looking for a different group.
Yeah.
But
Right. Well, and I think we all had the thing we explained to people.
yeah,
We all had the elevator pitch for what a role-playing game
right,
was that we used whenever we met somebody and they said, "So what are you into?" And you're like, "Well, I'm into this, that, and the other thing, and into role-playing games." And we all had the thing we said
right.
because we were used to having to explain it. And now, I mean, so I
But
teach
even no matter
19 to
what we said, it had to be interpreted by the person who was listening. And I
right.
found over the years, a whole lot of people were like, "I don't know."
I still don't understand it.
Yeah,
I mean, I
but
still don't understand what you mean by mechanics. I don't understand what you
yeah,
mean by, okay, I get pretending to be somebody else, but you're telling me that you do all of it?
yeah.
You know?
What do you mean you pretend
Yeah, I mean,
to be someone? I don't want to be some.
someone?
No.
I mean, what kind
Yeah,
of a horrible loser would want to pretend to be someone
yeah,
else? Get out there and get a life. It was very hard to explain.
right. But
Even and
nowadays,
even the now everybody knows. Yeah,
they
I
see it,
mean,
and people say, "I want to do that thing," and so
uh-huh. And you can always just say, if you want to know, go watch a show.
yeah.
There are a ton of, like YouTubers that are doing this. There are tons of ways you can observe a game and see what you think of it.
And I think that's. I mean, I know. I not even think. I know. I've got to say I think because I don't have any hard data to back it up. But I know that's what's opened up this new generation. Is people are no longer
Mhm.
having to be convinced to try it. People are looking for people. They're looking for.
Right.
I want to play this. I want to try that thing. Who can who
Mhm.
can I try it with? As opposed to, would you like to come and play with my group? We'll be
We're
in
gonna sit in the
Joe's
basement
basement
and
on
eat a lot of
Friday night.
pizza and, and drink too much beer. Oh,
um,
that is exactly what I did.
all right, you know what? I've gotten to the point where I'm going to stop sketching for right now because I
I
need.
love
It's
it.
at the point where it needs to go to the next phase. So those who
Mhm.
watch know that I will finish this up over time, and if you want to be among the first to see it, then you want to join our free newsletter, 50yearsinthedungeon.com, .substack.com. And you get to see the finished pieces when they're done before anyone else does. You also get the insides on who's going to be our next guests and where to where to catch the reruns and all of that. You also get the opportunity to send in questions ahead of time for use on the show. And it's also just a cool group of people to hang around with. So check us out there. And thank you. Also, you know what? While I'm doing something like a pitch, I will say, because I usually say this till the end, if you're watching uh, on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot. And if you don't want to do that, click the like button. That helps. What that helps is introducing other people to the show. That's what tells YouTube to share it. But right now, I'm sitting at about 475 subscribers, which I, I'd like to have more than that. I think it's a good show. So
You're
yeah,
so
please,
close to 500, right?
I'm so close.
Oh,
Anyway, there
yes.
we go. Um, so you came in through. So let me switch off. This will go to the side. I'll finish that up. Kish, I'll send you a copy when it's
I
done.
would love that. It looks utterly charming.
Thank you. Um, so you came in through fiction and comics, and you were
Mhm.
doing your own writing. While I knew you, so we were both on staff for D&D at Wizards. you were writing the Foxwoman,
Yes, yes, I was.
which was one of your first
It
Nebula
was it
multi
was
award.
it was a finalist for the World Fantasy Award. It did
Yeah.
not
Oh,
win.
well, it should have.
But thank you. And I mean, I comforted myself when it didn't win by people walking up to me afterwards and saying, it should have won, which is very soothing to the bruised ego. But yeah, that took me forever to write because it was my first book and I didn't really know anything about books.
Mm.
I was in writing groups, but these were all bootstrap groups. So we were all peers and we were all equally competent or incompetent at the
I
same
was talking
time.
to someone from one of your groups at lunch today.
What?
One of the
Who?
Thousand Monkeys.
Oh, the Killer Monkeys. Oh my goodness. The Killer Monkeys. That was a good group, actually. The Killer Monkeys included Ted Chiang, as I recall. Bridget McKenna. I'm trying to remember who else was in the Killer Monkeys, but it was a good group. And we met in my living room, and it that was very instructional because Ted Chiang, who is, of course, the winner of everything and the author of this story that inspired Arrival, um, he uh, he was very opinionated, and he was unafraid to say if he thought something had trouble. And he killed one of my stories dead for 10 years because he pulled up a reason, like a logical, a scientific problem.
Right.
It was an engineering novella, and I'd gotten one of my beats wrong, and he was like, "You, this is just broken," and I just was like, "Well, I can't fix that." And 10 years later, I talked to him and said, you broke that story. I never
Yeah.
did do anything with it." And he said, "What did I say?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, maybe you just get over the ice fast." So I went back and I just finessed it. Nobody has ever caught it except for Ted Chiang. And it went on and it won like a world fantasy. So obviously, it was better than I thought it was.
Yeah. So, so you were doing the writing while you were working at Wizards, um, and how much how much were your connections from working in publishing uh, involved in getting that out, as opposed to the connections from? There's a very strong literary just group like the Killer Monkeys. Like I'm in a group called the Illiterates, and there's a very strong support network around of writers with
Mhm.
everyone points. But I don't even that question's going nowhere. Tell me about how you
This isn't a question
segued
so
out of
much as a comment.
yeah segued into doing that as the focus of what you do.
Well, I mean, uh, I always wrote part-time, and to be honest, I don't think I would have continued to write if I hadn't gotten praise, and especially in the early stages. Um, so the reason for Fox Magic, Fox Woman at all is that I had written a story, Fox Magic, which had won something, and I was at that moment trying to put together, this is when I still worked at Tor Books. So I was trying to put together a collection of Coney Island stories set on or about or around Coney Island. And we had a editor at Tor who had been a popular Western writer, and I asked him if he would write a story because Bat
Mm.
Masterson, what actually ended his life, ended his career at Coney Island. I was
Huh.
like, "This sounds awesome. You should write this." And he said, "I'll make a deal with you. I will write it, but you have to write me an outline for a book based on this story of yours." So some of it was contact. Oh, Jefferson, hi. Yeah, the uh he uh he did it and I wrote the outline. But Would I have written the outline if I hadn't had the incentive of somebody asking for it? So really, I was a reluctant writer
Right.
up until 10 years ago. Everything I wrote sort of grouching and complaining and miserable and hating my life, but I did it. And uh, and then 10 years ago, I started. Uh, I am a grown ass woman. I'm a sensible
You
adult.
are.
And
Yeah.
it took me until 10 years ago before I said to myself, well, if you don't like writing, maybe you're not writing the right stuff. So that changed
Yeah.
everything. And I wrote 3 books in a row that I thoroughly enjoyed writing, and they were fine. And now I'm writing games, and
So
that's the same thing. I'm just thoroughly enjoying it.
wait, so I'm kind of doing the chronology in my head. So if it was 10 years ago, there's still like a 10-year gap between when you left Wizards and when you had that epiphany. What was going
And
on
I wrote
in 10 years?
4 books,
Four
yeah,
books. That,
which were I was
so that was the
miserable while I
miserable
wrote them.
writing as opposed to the joy of. Okay, I got it.
I writing first drafts is really hard for me. It's
Hmm.
part of what rewriting is interesting, but very, very time consuming for me because I'm obsessive, and every word is interrogated.
Right.
This game, just to give an example, this thing is set more or less in something that looks like 1911 to 1913, and every time I used a word that I wasn't sure how old the word was, like teenager or that kind of thing, I looked it up and found out first use, and then I decided, like, wonderland, is wonderland a word that would have been used? And it was, in fact, but there were plenty of words that were not, and so I had to make decisions. But then, like, lifestyle turns out to be a word. um, so uh, so there was that's what rewriting is like for me.
Right.
Very, very slow, fiddly, sort of every word and every phrase and every rhythm and stuff. And but that's fun and interesting to me, whereas the initial blank page is terrifying. The nice thing about writing a game is that I wasn't afraid of the blank page because it didn't carry the same freight.
Right.
Um, I was able to build, accrue the mechanics and accrue the setting and accrue this stuff. Slowly it accumulated instead of me starting at the blank page and saying, okay, so I need a name for a character.
All right. So you through the conversation we've said that the though you got in and you played D&D earlier, it wasn't the thing you played a lot or most of in your gaming heyday, as it were. And uh, this new game is a new game. It's not just
It's
a setting.
entirely new. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what um, what kind of mechanically what kind of game is it?
Um, the primary actions in this thing are coziness and chaos. So the point of the game was the concept of pother, the idea, which is a British term that basically means trouble. Pother is chaos monkeys are pother engines,
Hmm.
and so pother was my theme. Pother and coziness, and those two go together in existing forms, specifically the classic farce structure. So pother, which is the case, like if you read P.G. Woodhouse, who's like the king of pother, characters are basically comfy, happy-go-lucky, lovable or likable or hilarious people.
Yeah.
And then crazy stuff happens. And just it gets crazier and crazier and crazier. Um, so pother was my primary mover for the mechanics, and that means every single mechanic is about how do we, because the trouble with this, as we all know, everybody who's ever tried to do certain kinds of games, is that a chaos-based game spins out of control. And sometimes they can make a virtue of it, like with Fiasco, where they're like, yeah, it's going to spin
Right.
out of control, get over it. But for most games, what happens is that it never pulls itself back together.
Right.
But we have, so a lot of what I was trying to do is build something where random stuff happens, but it's not based on, okay, everybody roll. Did anyone hear anything? It's based more on things that are not based in the core events. I don't know quite how to explain this. For example, you can be in the middle of something like trying to host a big dinner party,
Mm.
which actually is one of the situations. It's called a very important party, and it's one of the situations from the book. In a very important party, it's critical that you get this party right, and it goes wrong in all of these sitcom-y ways. But instead of it saying, okay, phase one, phase two, phase three, phase four, it's like any of these 15 things could happen. And meanwhile, these other random things are happening. And this all sounds quite disorganized, but it's not within the structure of the game, because you've got these frameworks for when you roll for what. You've got a timer that goes off every 30 minutes, which uh, injects a random moment
Mm.
that forces the characters to counter that moment. And the random moment can be any of a number of things. It's encouraging pother with things like, uh, unlike a D&D game or a fifth edition game where you've got criticals, what you've got is you can always succeed provided you're willing to pay a dire enough price. Almost always succeed. There are deeds that are just completely impossible, and sometimes it's just you're never going to hit that number. But you can, uh, if you fail, side effects will happen. And then if you attempt to counter the side effects by, for instance, what we call summoning pother, which allows you to replace a base stat with a different base stat, if you do that, then you have side effects that are based on summoning pother. So it's harder to explain than it is to play.
Right.
um, it actually, it takes about half of a session, and GMs stop even looking at the book, because as soon as you understand it, then everything is intuitive to a game where we are going to make things kind of wild, but then we're going to bring them back together.
Right.
So a lot of my sort of story structure experience, not just with my own fiction, but also I teach workshops every summer for people who want to be professional novelists for how do you structure a novel. And then I also just, I've been teaching narrative theory
Mm.
for the last 5 years. So I'm always thinking about what story structures are possible beside the ones that fantasy novels tend towards, and also role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
A role-playing game almost invariably is built on a quest structure right up until it becomes a king-making or a kingdom-making structure. Um, but there isn't a lot of room for other weird kinds of stories, because that's not the nature of the environment through which the story is moving. And
Right.
it's just not the expectation of the player. So for me, this game is meant to be for newer players, but also for players who just want to try something that's pretty different.
Mm-hmm.
Because the ways that there's also a slider bar, which depending on how far you are out on the two ends of the slider bar, this is going to affect the kinds of things you can do, some of your role-playing decisions, and also, some of your ability to generate the numbers you need to succeed at tasks.
Right.
So it all kind of goes crazy. But then it also has built into it the way you bring it back together at the end, largely supported by the fact that it's a cozy game, which means that ultimately the players are going to expect to be end every session with their characters with their feet up on a comfy ottoman,
Right.
drinking a hot cup of cocoa and saying, wow, that was a day.
As you're talking about that, I was thinking about the difference between an adventure based storytelling, which is a line forward. You're constantly moving
Hmm.
forward, versus either as you say, a farce, or mysteries, which are about
Hmm.
expanding questions that get
Hmm.
answered, or expanding chaos, which gets resolved and resolved and resolved. It's kind of a blossoming. Uh,
Exactly. I mean, there's a wonderful book that I recommend. It's the only book on writing that I ever have students work with. It's called Writing Shapely Fiction, and it's by Jerome Stern, who was a fantastic flash fiction writer.
mm,
But the book starts, the first 50 pages of the book are what he calls the shapes of fiction.
mm,
And the journey, which basically is the quest,
right.
is one of them. You know, moving geographically, your protagonist moves geographically through space, through an escalating series of events that contribute to a position. And the Campbellian, monomyth, quote monomyth, is a classic example of that. But he has something like 10 other possibilities for shapes that a story can have. And you can basically use those shapes on almost anything. So for this game, because it's meant to be cozy, one of his shapes is called a day in the life. And a day in the life stories, and we've seen these. There was like a Michael Douglas movie called Falling Down.
Mm,
Basically, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a day in the life story. There's a ton of stories where the point of it is, here's how the day was supposed to go, here's how it started, and now it went off the rails, and here's where we ended up.
right.
It doesn't even have to be a day in the life, because like the first five Harry Potter books were a year in the
A year in
life.
the
They
life.
all started with a specific chronology. So it just has to be a sequence of events that everybody knows how it's supposed to go, but it doesn't. And that is an idea that works perfectly with a cozy. A day in the life. What are we going to do today? Let's have a picnic. It's not really a big quest. We're just going to go have a picnic. But what do we have to do? Oh, we have to figure out where we're going to go. What are we going to do? Who's going to bring, the chicken salad? And that stuff ends up being actually very, very fun when you add all of these chaos engines to the game, because essentially it's like real life, except the things that go wrong are comical
Mm,
and contribute to um, fun and entertainment, instead of, oh my goodness, my car just broke down. How am I going to get to work today?
right. Ryan Watt asked if you had any books or workshops that you recommended. So it sounds like the shape of was it the shape
I
of
think writing shapely fiction
writing
can
shape
be
of fiction?
super useful. I also am thinking a lot about this, because I would like to write another book for this. And what I want to write is a campaign book.
Mm,
And so I've been starting to do research into how campaigns work and the campaigns that I've liked the best. And not thinking at the moment about the game master player campaign, the specific table, but
right.
thinking when we as designers say, I'm building a campaign. You read some of those giant adventures, and they're like clearly 2 years of play. There's at least 50 weeks of work in there. And so thinking in terms of how do you design for something where readers, players are going to expect escalation, when they're going to be currents of interest and distraction, and there's so many things that go into a campaign. And how do you do something with a campaign besides just make sure that instead of 50 rooms in your dungeon, you have 200 rooms in your dungeon? So the short answer, Ryan, is I do recommend that. But honestly, because I'm doing some of this thinking myself, if you dropped me a line, I have been wondering about maybe teaching a class on this. Just like doing an online thing with some other people who are interested. And drop me a line, and that will remind me that this would be a thing that I've been thinking about.
It's a good time for me to bring up that people who want to get in touch with you maybe want to look at kijjohnson.com.
Hmm. It's the easiest way, although my email address is unbelievably findable. Please do not Please do not take advantage of that. By all means, write me, but please do not send me to some Russian bot farm or something. No, I'm at kijjohnson@gmail.com. So very easy, very discoverable.
Um, I guess before I get into the wrap up section, the one thing that you haven't talked about in terms of this game is why is it uh, why is it funny animals? Why not in the broadest term?
That is such a
Why
good,
choose
that
to make it?
actually is,
Yeah,
yeah, why didn't I do it with humans?
because you could have done
Um,
that. This everything you're talking about. This could have been a cozy human story. There's nothing
And
about
in
this.
fact, Flabbergasted is has a lot of the same kinds of things I'm trying to do, although I'm trying for a sort of softer flavor. The reason why talking animals is because first off, I'm always interested in writing into the sort of liminal space between, boy, that sounds like academic talk, but the liminal space between the human and the animal. Why do we define some things as people and some things as not? Why do we eat, cows but not dogs? All of these kinds of questions. How do we define personhood is
Mm,
one way to think of it. And that's what I write about a lot. Most of my books, that becomes a question. All of my short fiction, it turns up in. And uh, and I'm interested in it. I think we can say some really interesting things about humans when we start to ask what isn't human. This is the same thing science fiction people do when they write about aliens. And the same thing horror people do when they write about monsters. Um, the reason why it has its particular fluffy Edwardian flavor is because I'm a big fan of early, like Victorian and Edwardian children's literature, which is much of it's sappy and sentimental, but it isn't all. And Wind in the Willows is one of my very favorite books of all time. In 2016, I wrote a sequel to it as a sort of gift for a friend of mine whose husband had just died.
mm,
And it's called The RiverBank. And it's available on the Kickstarter. You can actually buy the book over at the backer kit for RiverBank, or you can just order it basically anywhere because it turns up at, eLibris and like Amazon. I didn't want to have to say that, but it's there. But yeah, so that's why it has this very historical Edwardian flavor, because that is a fascinating period.
mm-hmm.
And it's also um, because I read lots of adult books from this period as well. In a lot of ways, the English writers from 1919 on look back and say 1913 was the end of innocence, because by 1914 we're in the war and all of us are dying, and then we're in the interwar, and then we're in World War II. So it was the last moment that England uh, erroneously could look at itself with a certain comfortable complacency and say, yes,
Right.
this is heaven. And although it wasn't for everybody, and believe me, I've read a lot of the history, there's a lot of stuff going wrong for women, for working class people. There were a lot of things going wrong, but it also was a period when a lot of interesting things were happening. Automobiles are starting to come up. We've got telephones starting. We've
Right.
got, so many things going on. So it's a really cool time. And the talking animals are because I didn't actually want to write about 1911. I wanted to write about Wind in the Willows and Alice in Wonderland and Winnie the Pooh and P.G. Woodhouse
Right.
and Jerome K. Jerome and a whole bunch of wonderful people.
Yeah. No, it certainly is. That is a very good way to talk about a time and a place and make it clear we're not really talking about that
It
historic
is not,
place.
yeah. If we engage directly, and this is something I've commented on several times in fiction I've written and thought about in this context as well, any writer who writes lighthearted literatures like romances or comedies or things like that, and any writer who writes in any historical period, no matter what their flavor is, you are you are you are writing about a time and a place when things were dark for a lot of people.
Right.
So if you can write about this, you can write your comedy set, in World War II, but you have to recognize and own the fact that for World War II was not a time where people laughed about that kind of stuff. If anybody remembers Hogan's Heroes, which was a sitcom from the
Thinking about
60s,
that.
I think, 70s, which takes place in a gulag for, shot down
The prisoner of war.
allies. And it's like, I mean, how horrifying is that? But and we're much more aware of this kind of thing. We're not as tone deaf as we used to be, but we're still, it's like writing a comedy set in any time is requiring that you disregard or you counter argue the bad parts, because they were always bad for lots of people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look at the any of the farce farcical movies from the 30s and all the
Hmm.
Depression era, lighthearted.
Right, right.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And the assumptions being made, the casual racism, the casual misogyny, which isn't even, I mean, I read a lot of golden age English mysteries, and the racism is, I've learned to read them and identify the difference between a systemic racism where the characters are breathing this air, or the writers are breathing this air, and so that's what they're writing,
right.
and the ones where they actually think this stuff. They aren't
Yeah.
just breathing this, they are thinking this. And some of and I have to make a decision when I read these things. How do I feel about this author who is using these slurs? And in many cases, they're using them. It's not even that they are racist or sexist in every way. It's that, it's like Niall Marsh, who's a mystery writer, writes these utterly fantastic Maori characters, and yet she uses racial slurs for other populations. So how do I read her? How do I justify her? These are questions that I think most writers have to ask, and I think most game writers should be asking if they aren't already. How do I move forward into the 21st century, into a world where we have to acknowledge that it wasn't all Skittles and beer in
Yeah. I
1911.
mean, wow, is that a big ongoing question that, like you say,
Hmm.
writers and designers of all sorts are struggling with. The people that want to say, "I just want to tell a story." Like, well,
Yeah, I get it. I
y-
totally get it. You mentioned The Fox Woman, which is set in medieval Japan,
mm,
and I wrote a sequel in 2003, which was set 150 years later in Japan. And actually, technically, it's classical Japan, but that's too much information. But and I had a third book in mind, which I never wrote, even though I have it fully plotted, even though I understand all the characters and I love them dearly. And I will never write because the world had moved on.
mm,
And I would love to write that story. Maybe someday I would write it for my own entertainment, but I'm not the right person to tell this story anymore. Nobody else would tell my story,
right.
but I'm still not the right person to be telling this story. I have other stories to tell. Ideas are cheap. The time to write them is the hard part.
That's there. Yeah, there's another whole conversation.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. All right. So before we wrap up, um,
Mhm.
what else? Oh, I want to also want besides your website, I want to bring up you've got a Patreon where people can
Mhm.
come and be part of your community. Uh,
Mhm.
Patreon.com/Kij Johnson.
Mhm.
A,
There is an entire unpublished novel there, which is my sequel to my Wind in the Willows sequel, which was called The Riverbank. This entire unpublished novel is called The American Tour. And I post idiosyncratically at the moment because when I moved over to games, I knew I would, for a moment, I was not going to be able to be consistent. But yeah, so join me there. Join me, just drop me. And I'm on Blue Sky as well. So again, Kij
Kij
Johnson,
Johnson.
my name.
It's good to be able to use that. It makes you, as you say, very findable.
Very findable.
Um, all right. So before we go, the Riverbank is currently crowdfunding uh,
Yes. Sign
through
up.
Cobalt
Sign
Press.
up. Yep.
It's a couple of weeks left. Please, please. I mean, if you like the look of this, there we go. This kind of thing, you should definitely check it out. Cute little.
There's just they're two completely different artists who have completely different styles. This is Kathleen Jennings, who's won a World Fantasy Award for her art. She did the art for my novel, The Riverbank,
Mm,
which, by the way, is not the same. It overlaps, but it's not the same. Um, and she's just wonderful. But yeah, you can also buy tea, specialty tea. You can buy it's we had a lot of fun
yeah.
thinking all this through, and I'm super excited by it, and I'm just really I've never done anything like this. I mean, I've never written a game
Right.
soup to nuts. I've never done a Kickstarter, and I've really enjoyed all of this. So
So yes, I'm sure
thank
if
you.
they've got something about it at your website, but also if you go to koboldpress.com, they are
Mhm.
you can find all the links and all you can buy a
Specialty dice. You can buy it's just there's a lot of cool
yeah.
stuff.
Check it out is what we're saying. Check
Check
it
it
out.
out. Check it out. You can also just do a search on RiverBank RPG and it gets you there, which I do because I keep forgetting to put it into my tabs.
You got it's great to have again easy findability is a
Hmm.
distinct advantage. Uh,
Yep, definitely.
all right, Kij, thank you very much for joining me. It's been
Thank
great
you.
to hang out with you again.
It has been great to see you at last. And I'm so happy that we got a chance to do this. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else you want to tell people before we say?
No, thank you all so much. I've been slightly tracking, but not very effectively, the comments. So if you have any questions that didn't get answered, again, findable. Just drop me an email. Tell me where the question came from. Because meanwhile, I'm also preparing for a summer workshop, so I'm getting a lot of weird emails. But so just remind me that you were here and ask your question. And thank you so much for joining us and being willing to listen to us chatter on.
That's what we do. The people who come here, they're ready for some nattering on.
Natter. That's my middle name, Natter.
All right, hold on a second, Kish. I'm going to do an outro, and then you and I can say our goodbyes.
Thank you.
All right, so there we go. That was my conversation with Kij Johnson. As so often happens, the hour got by, and there were things flying back and forth that I wanted to talk about. I hope that after she's done with all of this crowdfunding and running of seminars, that I can maybe get Kij to come back and have another conversation. We can talk more about that fun stuff. I want to thank everyone who showed up today. I didn't call out as many people as maybe I sometimes do, but sorry. Uh, Ryan Watt and Sir Rupetitious, of course. Our old friends like Jefferson Dunlap and Sue Wineline was here, and Michael J. Pastor. We can count on every week for good comments. Michael is asked here if I'm seeing here one of the questions I'd meant to bring up whether or not Kij prefers short stories to novels. If we have her back on next time, we'll ask that. Um, or you could drop her an email or contact her. Remember, kijjohnson.com is a place to go. As for me, you will remember that we have our free 50 years in the dungeon.substack.com newsletter you can go sign up for. And also, I also have a Patreon, patreon.com/Stanex, where you can come and be part of my community, where I talk about, all the stuff that's going on. I make sure anything I put out into the world on social media, if you're a part of that community, I make sure it shows up in your inbox so you don't have to worry about going out and finding it. And also, it's a good place to hang out, so consider joining us over there. I'll say it again while we're here. Please give us a thumbs up on whatever platform you're watching. Give us the heart or the like or whatever. If you're watching this on replay, it would be super helpful if you left a comment. Again, that's a thing that the algorithms, everyone always talks about the algorithm. The algorithms take those, and that helps to tell it that this is the kind of show that people like enough to engage with, which in turn increases the number of people it will share it with. So if you want to help the show, that's the way to do it. Leave a comment. Tell your friends about us too. This is another thing. It's very simple. Tell your friends how much you enjoy this wonderful show, chatting around. All of the past shows are available to watch on my YouTube channel, so subscribing there, not a terrible idea. I will be back tomorrow with another episode of Random Encounters, my improv cartooning show. And I'll be back next week with another guest who I was just sending some email around. The person I had lined up is not going to be able to make it, so I'm not sure who will be here next week. But I guarantee you it'll be someone interesting and fun to talk to, so come on back and find out. Until then, take care, everyone.